Good afternoon, Las Vegas. My name is John Glionna, and I'm a former Las Vegas resident and a book writer. And I'm here at my favorite bookstore here in Henderson with April Bielitov, and she's going to interview me about a new collection of stories I have. It's called Rebels and Outliers: Real Stories of the American West, and it is a collection of newspaper stories I did for the Los Angeles Times and other publications that try to explain the characters of who lives out here in our beautiful western part of the country. And I'm going to give the mic. Jimmy, take over.
Jimmy, take over. Hi, I'm April. We're at Coppercat Bookstore in Henderson, Las Vegas, and we are super excited to welcome John Glionna to our comfortable, cozy seating area to chat writing, books, and all things about inspiration. So, John, 26 years at the Los Angeles Times. What was the transition like to writing on your own, just finding your own stories?
Yeah, it sounds like it does take a long time. You know, people ask me, how did you spend so many years at one place? And when I was at the Los Angeles Times, the business was different. You could pretty much assume that it was cradle to grave, as my father used to say. And the older generation, if you got a job for a big company, you could pretty much assume that you were going to retire there, and they were going to be around, and they were going to. So there was a high ceiling when I was hired at the Los Angeles Times in 1989, in a sub bureau of the San Diego County edition. I looked up and I saw, this is a newspaper that had foreign desks and they had national desks. They had a magazine. I said, I can do everything here. So I stayed for a really long time. But, I'd worked my way up to the Los Angeles Times. I graduated from college with a degree in English and creative writing. I worked as a copy boy at the New York Times, answering telephones in Washington right away. Just got my foot in the door with the big, with one of the biggest papers in the world. And then I worked a succession of, smaller papers in Norfolk, Virginia for a few years, in Kansas City at the Kansas City Star. And then before I came to the Times, I worked as a feature writer at the San Diego Tribune in San Diego. So I had gotten better, and I polished my craft. And when I hit the Times, I was ready to rock. I was ready to do it.
Yeah, and then you served overseas too.
I served overseas,
North and South Korea, Malaysia.
In between 2008 and 2012, I was the sole bureau chief. So I covered a big swath of Asia, and then I left in 2012 and came back, and that's when I moved here to Sin City, and I bought a house in Henderson. And I started writing about Nevada and the West, and it is probably the experience, the time of my career that has stayed with me. When I left the Times in 2015, had I not liked Las Vegas or Nevada, I would have. My wife at the time was still living in San Francisco. I would have just left, sold my house. But I stayed because I wasn't done with Nevada. Nevada wasn't done with me. So I started, after 2015, no longer with the LA Times. I started freelancing for the Review Journal and other publications. So this book, Rebels and Outliers, is a book that covers 30 years of work of my work at the Los Angeles Times. It encompasses most of the states in the West, including Nevada. There is a 2002 book called Outback Nevada: Real Stories of the Silver State, which is all Nevada stories. And there was a book in between called No Friday Night Lights: Reservation Football on the Edge of America, which is a traditional. These are collected stories. The first book is collected stories. No Friday Night Lights is a traditional nonfiction narrative of me going to a small town and writing about a very small town in Nevada. So all my work pretty much touches upon Nevada still. So that's why I have a good following of readers and friends here, and that's why today, after we do our talk, I'll be signing books, here at Cindy's, Coppercat.
So the book on Nevada, those stories that you went out and sought, or those were assigned stories? Talk a little bit about that process.
Any journalist who kind of thinks they're worth their salt kind of comes up with their own stories. When you're young, you get assignments and you make the best of them. But Yeah, no, I pretty much, they would give me an assignments and I would do it occasionally, but for the most part, if I saw a story and I would come in and pitch them. So, I lived here in Henderson. I had a relationship with the city editor who basically said to me, just go find stories out in the ether. And so I would call them and say, hey, I want to go here and I want to go there. I can take a trip and do these two stories. I would go off. I would hire a photographer. We would travel together. And as we talked, you and I talked yesterday, Nevada is a big state. If you want to drive and do a story about Winnemucca, you better leave pretty early because, it's a long road up there. And so it's a big state to cover. And, did you know that, and I found this out, that Nevada is the most mountainous state in the United States?
Wow, I hadn't thought of that.
It doesn't seem like the way, but it's north-south moving mountains. And so if you're driving north to south, you're always in some sort of basin with mountains on either side. But if you go across the state, like on the 50 or the 6, you're up and down because you're crossing those mountains. So, Nevada doesn't get it doesn't get the juice as its sexy neighbor California.
No, it doesn't.
And it's the golden state. And then what is like in the Olympic is the silver medal? Is that the second medal you get versus the silver state? But by far, I prefer seeking out stories in Nevada, and I'll tell you why. By now, everybody in California has a PR agent, no matter if they're from small town California or whatever. And they ain't no PR agents, and no one's got a public affairs agent here. People are they're real deal. And one of the things that's really interesting is that Nevada has a fascinating mining history, much like California had, and that after the 1849 gold rush, sort of panned out, Nevada had its silver, the Comstock lode, in Nevada. And when San Francisco had its 1906 earthquake, and San Francisco, which was the financial capital of the West at the time outside Denver, it was devastated, and they had to rebuild. And the money to rebuild San Francisco came from, guess where? Nevada, because Nevada miners were taking the silver out of the ground, they were selling it, and it was shipped right to San Francisco to rebuild that city. So San Francisco has a lot to be thankful for to us.
Right.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, and Nevada also has, we were talking briefly about the loneliest road.
Loneliest road.
And if you think about just all the wide open space, but then you also contrast that with places like Rhyolite. You go out there and visit, and there's these large structures that once existed. These were bustling cities.
Yeah.
And now it's just like a dusty place, and you think there's nothing there.
Yeah.
There's no story.
Yeah.
But you found characters. You found...
Nevada is just full of characters. There are people who choose to live here, and they choose to sort of, find a life and build a life. I remember a story that I did in Austin. And Austin is sort of a mining town. Have you ever been to Austin?
No, I haven't.
Beautiful. It's it's in kind of right in the middle of the state. And there was a guy who was Serbian of descent, and he opened up a general store and restaurant. And in 2016, it was the self-described Donald Trump headquarters for Nevada, and he was a Trumper. And if he thought you were liberal, he wouldn't let you in. Oh. And he was real proud of that. And so I went up, and when I walked in, he asked me right away who I voted for. And I'm as liberal as they come. So we did not have a meeting of the minds, but we were like, basically, he said, well, you look like a liberal. I go, yes, sir, I am a liberal, But because, once you leave Las Vegas and before you get to Reno, it's all red. And that's just how it is. That it seems that's where the politics aside, voting the Republican ticket just seems to work for the lifestyles of people who live out there. And so in much of my reporting, other than that story, which I purposely went out to interview somebody who was conservative, I try to keep my politics out of my reporting because there are so much more to experience than which person you voted for. Right. Life is just full of other rich kind of things to talk about and to be influenced by. Right. So I've been kind of a wanderer in my journalistic career, and I'm very proud of that. I'm very happy about that. I'm also an outsider. I grew up in the East Coast, and so when in upstate New York and Syracuse, there are mountainous areas and driving, and when you came across, when you came into the town city limits, there it was. But here in Nevada, there are vast distances between places, and the role of the outsider, the newcomer, I think, is to take a look and sometimes point out certain things that maybe the locals have long known but forgot to notice. And so you would say, well, look at that. That's interesting, don't you think so? And then, I'm not really writing for the locals. I'm writing for, say, in my Nevada stories, I was writing for a Las Vegas audience, and in this book, I was writing for a Los Angeles audience. But that's where I kind of go. I kind of see myself as an interpreter. I don't know. It would probably be good to have someone who knew a heck of a lot about the area, who studied it in college and knew all the history, and that's what the locals are for. That's the people who I interview. I kind of find them out and then rely on their knowledge.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So it's been a ride.
Was there ever a time where there was a story idea that you sought out that you weren't able to get?
Well, yeah, there was one. In a nutshell, I once met a man who worked at a little diner in I won't say where it is, Middlegate. It's in Middlegate, and it was a diner, and he struck me and my photographer colleague because he made extended eye contact with us, and we were just on a story coming back having coffee, and we were looking at it, and there was a guy over there kind of giving us the kind of the the mean eye, and we asked about who he was, and I went up to the bar and I said, who is that guy? And they said, oh, that's Bob. Bob is he rode his bike through here about 5 years ago, and the owner took pity on him, and she hired him, and he works here. And then she goes, Bob's a real character. He suffers from multiple personality disorder, and he has 3 different personalities, and we never know which one's going to show up to work, and one of them is a woman. And I go, wow, how do you know when the woman comes? She goes, well, his voice goes up an octave. So I went back to the table with my photographer. I go, dude, listen to this. And so the owner happened to be there, and I called her over, and I said, we're reporters. We would love to do a story about Bob. And she said, oh, yeah, Bob, come on over here. And Bob very reluctantly came over. And she said, this is a reporter. He wants to do a story about you. And so Bob was kind of deer in the headlights. And it wasn't until another month or so before I was ready to do the story. And I called the owner back, and I said, hey, I'm ready to come up and talk to Bob. She goes, the day after you were there, Bob disappeared for weeks, and we couldn't find him. And so in the end, I couldn't interview Bob. Now, the story I really would have liked to have told, I wouldn't have made fun of Bob that he suffers from from something where he lives with 3 voices in his head. What my story was about was the accepting part of small town Nevada, that they would take somebody who was so different and they would prize him and give him a home and make him part of the family. That was my story. That would have been my story. But luckily, if I see a story I want to write, I get them. For the most part.
Yeah, because there are sometimes we have to make decisions and choose not to pursue a situation. And
like you were saying with early on, we do as professionals. We can't just kind of barnstorm in, and sometimes you have to. Sometimes you have to if you're working as a journalist. I was working in Los Angeles for the Times in the late 90s, and it so happened on the previous night, I was working the Saturday shift. There was a young Korean woman who had picked her dad up from his Korean restaurant, and they were driving on the 110 north-south through downtown Los Angeles. He had worked so hard that day, he'd fallen asleep in their kind of aging van, and the door opened up, and he rolled out onto and she just looked in the rearview mirror and saw her dad's body tumbling and get hit by another 2 cars. It was a horrible crash. So the next day, the editors, say, well, we know where the family lives. Go out there and do some interviews with the family. And so I drove up, and people were in mourning, and I walked up, and I immediately knew that my presence was, and I had to say, I went back, and I wasn't welcome there. Yeah. I could not tell the story. And sometimes, as we were talking about before, sometimes people deserve their privacy, and the reporters sometimes have to do things, and that's really sometimes what gives the press a bad reputation. I will say, on another occasion, there was a school shooter who had killed some young students and some of his people he went to school with, and I was assigned. It was in Northern California to go interview the mother of the shooter. So we found out where she lived and knocked on the door, and I said, my name's John Glionna. I'm from the Los Angeles Times. I really would like to talk to you about your son. A story is going to be written about him tomorrow, and I want to make sure that whatever's in it is right. And that's why I'm coming to you, because you can tell me the truth and not somebody so-and-so teachers. And she said, I would love to talk to you, but I am a broken woman, and I can't speak. And I was a reporter, but I was really a human first.
Right.
And I said, I understand. And I went back to the car and I called my desk and I said, the mother's not talking. And the editor said, well, did you tell her you were from the Los Angeles Times?
Dear.
And I said, yeah, I did. That didn't work. So that's, and when you're out and, you're not covering you're not responding to breaking news. There's a certain bedside manner that you have with folks that that you kind of go, and my thing is like this isn't like our interview today. It's not a census questionnaire where you're holding up your questions and going through. We're having a conversation, and that's what you try to do. I mentioned previously that I had gone to Albuquerque during the last year when Breaking Bad was in its final season. And I wanted to write about like how accurate was the depiction of methamphetamine sales and cooking and all that kind of stuff. So I went in and I had lined up before I got to Albuquerque 3 guys who were in treatment from being meth heads on the street. And so they all sat down, and the woman at the center introduced me. I sat down from a long conference table, and okay, like here we are, right? So rather than just kind of launching and asking questions, I just told them a story about my own family's drug use. And we talked about it. It was, happened to be my younger sister. And I didn't do it so much to break the ice, but because, hey, we're all human beings. And I have some experience. I've never been addicted to drugs, myself, but it's touched my life in other ways. So that's what you try to find when as I come in as a very liberally oriented person coming in to interview a conservative rancher. It's my job to find the common ground and making sure we have more in common than we do, than we do in difference. And that's the thing that I would say in 2025 that a lot of in the liberal bubbles like Las Vegas and where I live in San Francisco and Los Angeles, people are saying, well, I don't have anything to say to people in flyover country. They're so different than I am. I can't have a conversation, and you can have a conversation with those people. I spent 4 months in McDermott, Nevada, writing a book about a small football team there, and I have to say that I met several of the people that I hold them as dear friends, and their politics couldn't be any redder, all of them. And we've just so chosen to sort of make a joke about it. Hey, guess what? We have different political views. Who cares?
Right.
And so there is that. But yeah.
Well, touching on Rebels and Outliers, how did you whittle down what stories to include?
Oh, it's a good question. It was kind of funny because I had chosen a bunch of stories that I really thought that I liked the writing. And my editor called and he says, hey, I love this choice, but we don't have enough women. And it was just kind of weird. And I'd never thought of it. I go, God, I never really thought that I wanted to be, inclusive. So we went back and I found a bunch of, this is really good too. I should have chosen this story before. And, but it was a selection process, to be sure. Some of them were natural. There's one story in there that is first person, which I wrote about a personal experience I had, and the rest were people I met. But the personal experience were that I had I drove my father. My mother had passed away. My father had dementia of sorts, and he was living with a sister who was living in Florida, where she was living in the Bahamas. and her husband took a job in Ketchikan, Alaska. So they were moving, like you couldn't have moved any further in the United States. And so rather than make our father fly, so my sisters and I said, well, let's rent a mobile home, and just, won't it be fun to drive across, Albert Brooks would drive across the United States. Well, we took my father, and one of the sisters turned out to be evil incarnate on the way. And we fought like cats and dogs. So I wrote a piece about, and it was the idea about families, even when you're adults, sometimes you don't put aside the things that the differences you had when you were children. And it was kind of interesting. So, and it took place kind of in the West. So that was included. But yeah, it's, I would say one of the things that if I can shamelessly pitch this book, this cover here, it's on Amazon, it's on all the big booksellers. You can also buy from the University of Nevada. There are some stories that I kind of look at like my children. When I wrote them, I love them dearly. I chose every word, and not that better words probably could have been found by another writer. And then I put them aside and I went. And so one story was from like 1999, and another was from 2015. So 15 years apart, and they were all pretty much forgotten about because they were published in newspapers, and they're in the archives. But to hold this book for me to look at, well, here's my trip to the Mojave Desert phone booth, and then over here is me hanging out with the night watchman of Alcatraz, and then there's the baseball team at San Quentin Prison that plays all home games. And so I will say that when I read these stories aloud, and I don't do that often, I think, I did good on that one. And so we were talking a little bit about leads, and just maybe to give viewers an idea of my writing, if it's possible, I'd just like to read the beginning to the Mojave Desert phone booth. And this is this story was published in 19 and I won't read much of it. It's the Mojave Desert phone booth is the headline. Mojave National Preserve, California, with only the lazy Joshua trees and hovering buzzards out here to bear witness. This isolated expanse of high desert plain could well be among the quietest places on the planet. By day, the summer heat hammers hard, and the dull whistle of the wind is the only discernible noise. Come nightfall, the eerie silence is often pierced by the woeful bleat of a wandering burro. But wait, there's another sound. Ring. Along a line of wooden power poles running to the horizon in both directions, 14 miles from the nearest paved road, a solitary payphone beckons with the shrill sound of impatient civilization. Then it rings again, and again, and yet again, often dozens of times a day. The callers, a bored housewife from New Zealand, a German high school student, an on-the-job Seattle stockbroker, a long-distance trucker who dials in from the road. There's a proud skunk owner from Atlanta, a pizza delivery man from South San Bernardino, California, and a bill collector from Denver given a bum steer while tracing a debt. Receivers in hand, they're reaching out at all hours of the day and night from nearly every continent on the globe to make contact with this forlorn desert outpost. They're calling the Mojave Desert phone booth.
That is fabulous.
It was awesome. The writing was okay, but it was just a like, who would have thunk, that there was. And as often happens, we as reporters sometimes, you write about something and then it dies. You know what happened after that story I read? Ma Bell took it out because there was so much publicity for my story. They went and they yanked it out. It had been there for years, and I wrote about it, and it was gone. But no. I shed a few tears at that. But so sometimes you got to let people give their privacy. Maybe I should have given the Mojave Desert phone booth its own privacy. But I had when I was working in the valley of Los Angeles, I went out one day and I'd heard about. There was a barber shop in North Hollywood, and there were three older Italian men, and it was a typical old Italian barber shop, and they had a piano there because they had a barbershop quartet. And so the piano was there, and it was like, and so I'd heard that, yeah, you ought to go over to this barbershop, because there was a guy named Russ. His name was Russ Turner. He was a studio musician in the 70s, but by the 90s had come about, he was homeless. He was on the street, didn't take showers often. But Russ would roll in every once in a while and play the piano, and he would play like an angel. So I went in, and I was there when Russ was, playing, and I did this piece about, again, that they were, usually business owners and the homeless are not like bedfellows, but they invited Russ in. And so the story ran on the front page of the LA Times, and then the landlord of the barbershop read it, didn't like the publicity, and then canceled their lease. So if John Glionna comes to you and you have a business and he wants to interview, maybe you should say no, because you never know what's going to happen.
Talk a little bit about your writing process, because for the most part, you've always been on deadlines. But when you took on the project of the football team in the far reaches of Nevada, that was kind of your own personal project.
Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly. Writing, when you're standing, as I was mentioning, a lot of young writers are afraid of this, the empty screen, and nobody likes to confront it. But you in a sense have this conversation, with yourself. And I had mentioned I have a process. I will tell someone, a friend of mine, that I'm going to write about something. I'm going to write about the women's right to vote or whatever, and someone will say, well, what are you going to say? Well, I don't know until I start writing. And there is this process that happens when you're thinking about things and you're making a sentence, going through your synapse to your fingers onto the screen, when the wheels are turning and you'll think, oh, I do think that. And then, oh, here, this happens. So one thing leads to another. They're sort of like mental dominoes that happen in your head when you're writing. And you can't, it's like making decisions going through a city. You can't make a decision what turn you're going to make on that intersection until you get there and you have to write. You can't say, I'm going to turn over there. You have to be there first. And that's whether that makes sense or not. You have to do that. So it is I find the moment that I think I was most interested in, and I think that's always a good place to start. And I say, if I were having a beer with a friend and we were in a bar, and I was saying, do you know who I met the other day? And I would say, and then I would start by saying, this guy's so and so, and this is how we start the story. People don't give I myself as a reader, have you ever started a book and say, I don't, this guy's losing me, and I want to put it down, but I feel I paid for this book, I'm committed. And I think with journalism, it's even, you need to hook somebody. I don't know if anyone's here ever been like a professional stand-up comic, but if you were, you would know that you have to hook that audience right away. First joke's got to reel them in. Yeah. Well, by the way, we're PJ, who was off camera, was indeed a stand-up comic, so he knows what I talk about. Yeah, shout out to PJ.
where can we meet John and get a copy of his new book, Rebels and Outliers?
Rebels and Outliers is available on Amazon. It's available on all the Barnes & Noble. It's available at the University of Nevada books online. And it is, it's Rebels and Outliers, real stories of the American West. And again, it's a compilation of stories that I wrote over 30 years as a journalist for the LA Times and other publications, going out into the unknown and meeting some pretty funky, wild, fun characters.